Alum Bluff towers over the Apalachicola River. The river has carved into it over geologic time, exposing millions of years of fossils. Each layer in the bluff tells stories of rising and falling seas, megalodon sharks hunting whales, or a shallow tropical ocean covering North Florida. Alum Bluff is also the western boundary of a biodiversity hotspot. Geology and biology converge in ecosystems unlike anything else in Florida, with plants and animals that are living fossils. Alum Bluff and the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines. These are the topics today on Coast to Canopy, an ecology podcast from WFSU Public Media. I'm your host, Rob Diaz de Villegas. This is a highly visual topic, and I recommend the video version and the accompanying blog post, which you can find at wfsu.org/ecologyblog or the WFSU Ecology YouTube channel. All right, joining me in the studio is Harley Means, Florida's state geologist and director of the Florida Geological Survey. Welcome, Harley.
Well, thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start first with just how Alum Bluff looks. Now, I remember when I first saw it, I kayaked up to it. So there's a bend in the river, in the Apalachicola River, and it's about a mile stretch. And as you get closer and closer, you see something a lot larger than you see on a Florida river. So describe, what does Alum Bluff look like?
Yeah, so as you're approaching Alum Bluff, as you said, particularly if you're doing it from the river, the first thing that you see is this big giant bluff, thus the name. And it's quite unusual for our state because it's a significant bluff. It's over 100 feet tall. And so, us flatlanders here in Florida are not accustomed to seeing much in the way of topography. So that's really the first thing you notice is just, here's this giant bluff on, along the eastern side of the Apalachicola River, and it's quite prominent, and it was what first struck me the first time that I saw it.
And so what caused it to be so tall and be so rocky as well?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, but really what has happened is the migration of the Apalachicola River back and forth in its floodplain actually bumps up against the sidewall there, or what we call the eastern side of its floodplain. And along that side of the floodplain, not much has been eroded. And in fact, once the river cuts into it, that's really the first it has eroded into these sediments that make up Alum Bluff. And there are, 4 nice geologic formations that are exposed there. And the lower ones are actually somewhat resistant to erosion because they're rocky, right? So limestone and some clay. And that sort of retards the erosive capabilities of the river. And so that's why you get those prominent bluffs along that part of the river in that region. On the other side of the river, we don't see that because the river has already meandered back and forth and eroded away those sediments that were deposited over there at one point.
Gotcha. And so there's 4 different layers that are present there. Let's start with the lower ones, and how old are they?
Yeah, so the oldest unit that you can see at Alum Bluff when the river stage is low enough is what's called the Chipola Formation, and it was deposited during what we call the Miocene epoch, and it's about 18 million years old. And what's really impressive about it are the abundance of marine fossils that you find there. And it's from those fossils that paleontologists are able to tell us something about the age of that unit.
Right above that is it undifferentiated Alum Bluff?
You got it. That's right. We call it undifferentiated as geologists because we haven't assigned it to a formation within the larger Alum Bluff group. So we just call it the Alum Bluff Group Undifferentiated Unit. And it's also a really interesting unit, but the fossils in it are quite a bit different. They're not marine, and in fact, they're terrestrial plant remains. And it's probably one of the most impressive assemblages of plant fossils in Florida. And plant fossils are pretty rare in our state. And you can find neat things like big palm fronds and nuts and seeds of plants that grew back probably some 15 million years ago. So again, it is another Miocene unit. It is younger than the one underneath it, and it's indicative of a time period when the climate was more temperate. And we know this from the fossil flora that has been identified from that unit.
Gotcha. And so if someone is watching the video version of this podcast, we can see Harley taking out one of those palm frond fossils. That's kind of a neat thing to see. To think it's 15 million years old, yeah.
It is, and it's probably wasn't something you were expecting to see me, find at Alum Bluff. Those layers don't immediately look like they might harbor these kinds of fossils, and certainly one that is potentially as large as a big palm frond.
Right. We have a kind of marine environment in the Chipola Formation. Now we have a terrestrial environment. So what's the next layer?
Yeah. So sitting on top of that unit, there's quite a big gap in time, but the next unit up is called the Jackson Bluff Formation, and it is, again, a marine unit, and you can tell that as you walk along the bluff because you see, again, a huge assemblage of marine fossils that come out of that unit. Now, it's a little different in that it was deposited in a different kind of a marine environment than the Chipola Formation. And you can notice that not only from the fossils that are in it, but also the color and type of sediment that comprises that unit. So it's kind of dark and organic rich, and it is indicative of an estuary. So it's more of a nearshore marine environment than the underlying Chipola Formation was. And it was deposited about 3 to 3.5 million years ago during what we call the Pliocene epoch.
We visited Alum Bluff last October a couple different times, and one of those was a ceremony.
It is my honor to dedicate Alum Bluff as the 9th state geological site and the first state invertebrate paleontological site. I would like to present this plaque commemorating this designation to you. And I would like to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
And greatly appreciated. And thanks to all of you. So as the state geologist, one of the neat things that I get to do, one of the many neat things I get to do, is I get to designate places in the state that are significant geologically and or paleontologically. And it turns out Alum Bluff is one of those unique places where both things are true. And so Alum Bluff was just a natural place for me to designate not only a state geological site, but also the first state invertebrate paleontological site. Now, there are others around the state that I may designate at some point in the future, but Alum Bluff is so well known in the geological literature and known to geologists in the southeastern U.S. that it really warranted the first designation with this.
Talk about the numbers of different marine species found in the Chipola Formation.
Yeah, so the Chipola Formation is really quite incredible, and it occurs, not only here at Alum Bluff, where we're talking about, but also further to the west. You can find exposures of it along the Chipola River, which is where it was named from. And paleontologists estimate that it has in excess of probably about 1,100 species of marine mollusks that have been identified in it. And that's a huge diversity of molluscan taxa. And what it's indicative of is a time when it was more tropical in North Florida. In fact, that was really probably the last time North Florida really saw a tropical climate. And that's reflected in all those amazing marine fossils we see. And we see fossil corals and fossil echinoids. And so, the whole diversity of things that lived in the marine environment at that time.
So when we visited Alum Bluff last October, I talked to Roger Portell, Invertebrate Paleontology Collection Director at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. Here's some of that interview.
I've been coming to Alum Bluff probably close to 40 years.
So what keeps you coming back here?
Well, it's the fossils, and so there is the rich bed of Chipola Formation fossils, and we'll always find something new, something that I haven't seen before. So at Alum Bluff, there are 4 main units. The 2 highly fossiliferous units that have invertebrates are the Chipola Formation, which is a 16 to 18 million year old unit, and then there's a 3 million year old unit that's called the Jackson Bluff Formation, and both of them have rich records of past invertebrate life. Invertebrates being things like mollusks, snails, clams, sand dollars, sea urchins, sea biscuits, corals, worms, barnacles, crabs, so lots of variety. And so we come back, there's constant erosion on the bluff, And so whenever we come, we find new things. In addition to the invertebrates, we also find vertebrate fossils and plant fossils. And so I've come out here with the plant folks, our paleobotanists, and we've collected, and recently they've begun publishing, after 100 years hiatus, on the fossils from Alum Bluff, the fossil plants. This is probably the richest bed of Miocene invertebrate fossils anywhere in the state. And because there's so many varieties, plus there's just a great abundance. And so we come here and it's fairly easy collecting. And in other places in the state, we'll find younger fossils, Pliocene, Pleistocene, and older fossils, Oligocene and Eocene. So pretty much no matter where you go into the state, you're going to find fossils.
So you've described a lot of species of extinct animals just from Alum Bluff. Talk about that, the history of that here.
I've described a number of species, some of which are from Alum Bluff, but some from other portions of the Chipola Formation. So the Chipola Formation occurs in Liberty County and Calhoun County. And so I'll collect the Chipola River and some of the creeks in addition to the sites on the Apalachicola River. And together we're able to piece this material together and find new species and describe new taxa. And mostly from these areas I've described echinoderms, the sand dollar sea biscuit sea urchins, and mollusks, the snails and clams. The next one that I'll work on is the long Kufus tubes that we find. Those are 2 meters long. And so we've extracted several of them, and it turns out it's a new genus. So we'll be describing the new genus, and it'll, of course, they'll have a new species associated.
So talk about just the University of Florida in general, just the collections you have there to work from.
Yeah, so I'm in charge of invertebrate paleontology. So these are all the fossils of animals without backbones. We have about 7 million specimens in the collection. And they range in age from the very oldest fossils, 500, 600 million years old, to nearly recent, the last 10,000 years. And the fossils have been collected by lots of different people, a lot of amateur collectors, a lot of professional collectors, research collections, and they're all curated and databased online. And they're available to the public if they want to see it through the specified portal, and they can see the kinds of things we've collected. So most of the fossils in the collection, about 70%, are of these mollusks, the clams and the snails. And then the rest are all the other minor groups. We have huge crab collections, echinoid collections, the sand dollars, the sea urchins, the sea biscuits. And people come from all over the world to study these fossils. And so it's a library of life, and they're available, and people will come and study them and try to figure out, answer all kinds of questions. How old are they? How did the deposit form? What was the water temperature at the time? What was the salinity? So lots of different questions. We do a thing called sclerochronology, just looking at growth rings, much like tree rings. Clams have growth rings, and you can see the season, so you can figure out how old things are. You can also tell all the kinds of habitats that these animals lived in based on the species that you find. And that's one of the things that we do, is we try to determine what the paleoecology of these things were. And, what the temperature was. Was it warmer? Was it cooler? Saltier? Was it near shore? Was it offshore? So lots of questions that can be asked.
So talk about going to Alum Bluff to look for fossils. Now, with this designation, does this receive extra protection than it didn't before, as far as it being a fossil site?
So, Rob, statutorily it does. And since its designation in statute, it does say that if people go there to collect, they are required to actually have the written permission of the state geologist. Now, what I would say is, that's probably not reasonable. And since the bluff is an erosional feature and it's constantly cutting in and it is eroding out fossils, and those fossils, eventually get deposited in the river and broken up and transported. If you go to Alum Bluff, we would just ask that, be respectful. Don't dig into the bluff and cause, huge blocks to tumble down and be eroded. And, if you want to pick up a fossil or two that have already eroded out, that's probably okay. But, it is recognized now as a state invertebrate paleontological site, so it is afforded a little more protection.
Gotcha. So over the years, we've talked about, I've done a previous video segment with you on Alum Bluff, and you brought in shark teeth. And even when the second time we visited in November last year, we found a very small little shark tooth. So talk about those. Those aren't from the Chipola Formation, right? Those are from a little later. But yeah, talk about the shark teeth there.
Yeah. Well, so, most Floridians certainly appreciate and understand, sharks live in the modern marine environment, and we're usually awed by them as, fierce predators and unique animals that live in our marine environment. And, kids are always enamored by sharks, but particularly if you find a shark tooth. And in this case, at Alum Bluff, you can find shark teeth, but you can even find the shark teeth of what was once the largest marine predator to have ever lived. So megalodon, and they're not common, but occasionally you can find a megalodon tooth there. But what kid is not super excited or amazed when they look down and see that little triangular shark tooth fossil? I certainly was, as a kid. So. Yeah.
Talk about the size of that tooth. I mean, the tooth that we found, it's like a little less than an inch, a couple centimeters. I don't know.
Yeah.
How big is a megalodon tooth?
Well, megalodon teeth can reach more than 6 inches in length.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really large example. Now, they don't all get that large. Most of them are smaller than that.
Yeah.
The largest one I have seen from Alum Bluff is probably no more than about 5 to 5.5 inches in length. But the size of the teeth is probably more reflective of the species of shark. And there are multiple species of sharks where the teeth have been found in the deposits at Alum Bluff. Primarily, they come out of the Jackson Bluff Formation. It's not unheard of to find one in the underlying Chipola Formation, but they're certainly not as common.
Right.
So the Jackson Bluff Formation is the one that currently is known to have more species of fossil shark teeth come from it.
Gotcha. And then I guess I remember talking at one point with you, maybe there are whale bones in there, maybe with evidence that they've been attacked?
Yeah, absolutely. You do find vertebrate remains there, and most of the vertebrates that you find are the vertebrate remains of marine mammals, which makes sense because it's a marine deposit. And many of those bones are broken up and tumbled, but many of them could show evidence of what might have happened to them, and why those bones might be there. And that evidence comes in the form of cut marks and other marks that are left as a signature of maybe a marine predator that might have attacked this marine mammal while it was alive, or it could have been a scavenger that chomped on the animal after it perished. But yeah, occasionally you do find ribs and vertebra and other parts of these marine mammals that have those signature marks on them. Paleontologists can take a look at those and use that as evidence for what may have been happening at that time with that particular animal.
So you have on this bluff some really large animals attacking each other, possibly a lot of huge diversity of mollusks. But then you have some other things that people might not think about as fossils. So talk about stromatolites.
Yeah. Back when I was first visiting Alum Bluff, I was enamored by all the different species of fossils that you could find there. But it wasn't for probably a decade or so that water levels got low enough at Alum Bluff to expose this unique thing that I stumbled across. And when I first looked at it, I was like, wow, that's kind of odd. So here's this big dome-like feature, and it had been, part of the top of it had been eroded away, and you could look at it, and it had concentric rings in it. And as a young geologist, I'm looking at this going, boy, that looks an awful lot like a stromatolite. And so what stromatolites are is they're not the body fossils themselves, but they are what these organisms were doing at the time. In other words, they were algae that were probably trapping sediment, and as they trapped sediment, they'd grow up through the sediment, they'd trap a little more sediment, and they'd grow up, and they were probably growing along and around the root bases of mangroves that were growing in that area at the time. And so a couple of colleagues and myself wrote a paper and described these unique stromatolites from Alum Bluff. And, the modern stromatolites that we see today, you can see down in Florida Bay, but the most famous locality is over in Australia in what's called Shark Bay. And those things are really neat, big dome-like structures that you see in a super hypersaline setting in Australia. So it's kind of neat to see something like that in the fossil record here in Florida. And you don't see those very often in the fossil record, certainly not from the Cenozoic.
Right. I mean, how far back do we find stromatolites in the fossil record?
Yeah, so stromatolites actually, it turns out, are some of the oldest examples of things that we link to living organisms. So in excess of several billion years ago, we know that these organisms were living in marine nearshore environments and doing the same kind of things, baffling sediment, and they left behind these really neat signatures of things we call stromatolites. So for billions of years, these things have been doing something very similar in creating these features we call stromatolites.
So you mentioned the water level.
Mm-hmm.
So when we went last fall, and probably right now as well, the water level is probably as low as I've ever seen it on the river.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're now it's an exceptional drought. So talk about what more we could see. We got out and walked around, and I'd like to talk about that too, because I had never, my first year we did an Apalachicola River trek. The Nature Conservancy guided up one side of Alum Bluff, so that was kind of cool, but we never explored it.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about what else we could see, and then so you sort of, once you are out of your kayak, out of your boat, what can you see on Alum Bluff?
Yeah. Well, Rob, you can see something different every time you go there.
Yeah.
And I say that regularly. I've been there more than 100 times, and I would say every single time I go, I see something new and unique and different. So walking from maybe the southern part of the bluff up towards the north, you'll notice that the strata aren't uniform in thickness, and you get a little bit of undulatory connection between the Chipola Formation and the overlying formation. So in other words, these formations are not uniform in their tops and bottoms. So they're not completely flat. And it's although Florida's geology can be sort of compared to a layer cake, and that's a pretty good analogy. When you go out in the field and really look at these places where the strata are exposed, that's really not what you see. So the tops of the formations are undulatory. The sediment changes from one end to the other. It gets more fine grain as you go to the north, depending on which unit you're looking at. If you start to look at the difference in the Alum Bluff group undifferentiated unit, it's completely different. So, it's not marine, and really what we believe it is and reflects is a migrating bunch of streams, braided streams that deposited a bunch of sediment, and all of the leaf litter and whatnot that got fell into the stream got preserved as a point bar or something. And as you walk along its flank, you'll notice that it changes drastically. It goes from more of a kind of a uniform, thick unit of sandy clay and silty clay to then all of a sudden you get these nice big deep incisions where it was probably a stream cut erosional feature. And so, it's completely different. Then you get up, and if you look at the Jackson Bluff Formation, which is probably the most recognizable unit there just because of its dark gray nature, it's pretty darn uniform from one end to the other. Now, I will say, the preservation of the fossil shell material is a little different, and that's probably more based on how recent the blocks have eroded and fallen off of the bluff. As soon as those shells are exposed to the atmosphere and to rainfall, those shells will start to dissolve away. So, you could have enough time pass where those shells, for the most part, have been dissolved in a part of it. But if you cut into the bluff and pull back the sediment, you'll see that, it's only because they've been exposed.
So you say it's the most uniform. Is that gray bar that you see from that sandbar across? Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
That's something I want to talk about now because so I've been going there for a few years on Apalachicola River Trek, and I always try to get an image of it, and I kind of lined them up. So I did that yesterday. I went back as far back as 2012, and between 12 and 13 there was a little bit of a sand slide, and then back in 16, back in 21, and then last fall 2025. Talk about the changing face of Alum Bluff. From year to year, even, it seems like it could change. The way it looks can change quite a bit.
It absolutely can, and it absolutely does, Rob. So in my 30 years of going there, it's changed pretty drastically. You can even look at some pictures in some of the FGS photo archives of pictures of Alum Bluff back in the 1930s, and you can see the differences. And it's different simply because it's there because of erosion. And it is the erosive power of the Apalachicola River that changes it. So as that river is cutting into those sediments and undercutting them, occasionally you'll have blocks fall off, and even sometimes you can have major slumps. And we had one of those at Alum Bluff. I want to say back in 2016. And you'll have to check me on the exact date there. But a huge bunch of the sandy material that sits on top of the Jackson Bluff Formation, a huge bunch of that broke off and slid down along with blocks of the Jackson Bluff Formation and created this huge this slump. And there was an estimate, a University of Florida researcher did an estimate on the volume of material that came out of there. It was pretty substantial. Florida is not known as a place where, we have landslide hazards like, other parts of the country are known to have. But periodically we do, and this is a place where that can happen. So over time, as the river cuts into that bluff and dislodges and undercuts, occasionally you'll have these big slope failures, and that's really what drives the changes that we see at Alum Bluff.
One thing that surprised me too, and it made it kind of hard for me to identify what I was looking at, was how quickly trees and shrubs grow on it.
Yeah.
It seems like from 2012 to 2013, like it lost a lot of vegetation. And then, it's funny, sometimes year by year, how much it just grows back again.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I agree with you. And, some of that has to do with, it's most of that material is always slowly slumping.
Yeah.
And, depending on how much time passes where it's somewhat stable, and plants can occupy and grow on it is probably what we're seeing there. Yeah. But, it's always sort of slumping off and goes in fits and starts. But maybe that's what's driving the colonization of parts of it by plants.
Right. And so you've been going there for 30 years, so you just said. So what brought you there the first time?
Fossils and geology.
Yeah.
So Alum Bluff is probably one of the most studied geologic exposures, certainly in Florida, but maybe even the southeastern U.S. And we know going as far back as in the 1850s, Alum Bluff is mentioned by early geologists who were coming down into Florida looking at the geology and trying to understand the geology of our area. So, as a young geologist and somebody who grew up here in North Florida, stomping around, it was a natural place for me to want to go because it was where I could see the most geology. And since it's our tallest natural exposure of geology, and you can see multiple geologic units exposed there, that's why I wanted to go there. And it was a bonus that when I got there, I got to find fossils.
What are your favorite fossils that you've ever found there?
Well, my brother and I had discovered some terrestrial vertebrate fossils that came from there and were important enough that they were donated to the Florida Museum of Natural History, so they're down in Gainesville now. Those came out of the base of the Jackson Bluff Formation, or maybe the upper part of that undifferentiated Alum Bluff group deposit. And they were really unique. It was a jaw of a unique animal that's now extinct, kind of a deer-like organism. That was really cool and impressive at the time, and interesting for me because it was something that was unique enough that the museum was interested in it. So we got to make a contribution to the museum. But, shark teeth are always a favorite, and, big meg teeth occasionally that come from there are always my favorite. But I think my favorite fossil from Alum Bluff is actually a mollusk. It's a gastropod, and it's called Ecphora. That's its genus. And it's a really unique ribbed gastropod snail that was probably a predatory snail that ate and feasted on other snails. But just the uniqueness of its shell, and it's a pretty coveted fossil shell. So when I first found a couple of those, obviously I was hooked on those. So I like Ecphora.
Yeah. When I first started doing ecology stuff at the station, one thing we did was it was a collaboration with the FSU Marine Lab, and we were in oyster reef, salt marshes, and then it's a place called Baymouth Bar. It's all just predatory snails, and I just fell in love with that and watching them eat each other. And you describe that, I kind of get this evocative kind of scene in my head of this with all these extinct snail species that are just eating each other.
Absolutely.
Millions of years ago.
No, you're right, Rob. And what's neat about it is here in Florida, you can stand at Alum Bluff and you can look at one of these paleo estuary deposits, and then you can go 50 miles to the south and see a modern analog that looks very similar to today as to what was going on 3 million years ago in this area.
Right. And then you talked about standing above it. So you just mentioned it's the largest geological outcropping. Is it also the tallest point above a Florida river? As far as
I know, Rob, it is. There are some other tall bluffs further to the west of here, like along the Shoal River, but I think Alum Bluff is the tallest natural exposure, certainly when river levels in the Apalachicola are low, like they are today.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that, you can see it. So you can approach it from a boat, but also you can see it from the side a little bit going on the Garden of Eden Trail on the Nature Conservancy property, Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. And I've done that hike a few times. And to me, it's, and you go through steephead ravines, which is also cool. And it's a little bit more work than a Florida trail. But then at the end of that part of the trail, you're looking down at the Apalachicola River from a view you don't normally see in Florida. And that always kind of strikes me.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. So, it's great to see Alum Bluff from multiple vantage points because it is so breathtaking and unusual to see, not only something as tall as Alum Bluff when you're coming at it from the river, but if you're coming at it from the land and you get to that bluff overlook, you can see 10, 20 miles to the west. Yeah. And, there are very few places in the state where you can naturally stand somewhere and see that far and be that high above the river.
We talked about those first three formations. So right on top of Jackson Bluff, what's there?
Well, sitting on top of the Jackson Bluff formation is something that stands out, and you really see it both from standing on top of the bluff and coming at it from the river. And it is this thick package of basically sand and gravel, for the most part quartz sand. And it's from a formation called the Citronelle Formation, and that's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it's what I did my master's thesis work on in the Panhandle. But essentially, it is a big deposit of quartz sand and gravel that was reworked and brought down by rivers and streams, and at some point it met the nearshore marine environment. Now, probably not at Alum Bluff, further to the south, but it's really not terribly distinctive, at least across its extent, because it's got so much quartz sand and gravel in it. It does not have much in the way of fossils, but the important character about it at Alum Bluff is that it's unconsolidated there. So it's sand and gravel, and it's not cemented together or stuck together with any clay or any other kind of material. So when it starts to erode, it can easily slump. And that's important for the formation of features at Alum Bluff and other places in that part of Florida that are unique geomorphic features called steepheads.
All right, now we welcome Bruce Means to Coast to Canopy. Bruce is the former director of Tall Timbers Research Station and the founder of the Coastal Plains Institute, among many other titles I could probably dig up if I had to. Welcome to Coast to Canopy, Bruce.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So I'm going to go back to Alum Bluff and our outing last November. We went up to a little waterfall coming out of the side of Alum Bluff, and we climbed up and we went back and saw a little stream. So talk about what we were seeing there on Alum Bluff. Either one of you, I guess, could chime in.
Well, I might chime in just from the geological and hydrological perspective. So when we were standing there looking at that, Rob, I'm sure I mentioned the term steephead, which we just said. So steepheads are unique geomorphic features that form in areas where you've got a deep sandy deposit like the Citronelle Formation, which is an unconsolidated quartz sand, and that sits on top of the Jackson Bluff Formation. And the Jackson Bluff Formation is clay and clayey sand. So it's fairly impermeable to the downward percolation of groundwater. So we all know Florida gets quite a bit of rainfall, and when that rain hits the land surface, part of what hits the land surface can percolate down and get into the underlying sediments, and that's what we call our aquifers, right? And that's where we get our recharge. But at Alum Bluff and in areas adjacent to Alum Bluff in this area, where that Jackson Bluff Formation occurs, that groundwater can no longer percolate downward, and it has to migrate laterally. And as it migrates laterally, it eventually will bleed off into the Apalachicola River Valley, right? And when it does that, you start to get headward erosion. So what we were seeing there was one of these steep head ravines. We didn't walk all the way up to the head, which is what we would call the steep head. But what you do is you would walk along and probably right on top of the Jackson Bluff Formation there until you get up to its head. So that's the mechanism for the formation of these things.
Gotcha. So one time with you, Bruce, we went down, I think it was in Torreya State Park, to look for Apalachicola dusky salamanders, which we'll talk about in a moment. And you took us to the actual Steephead Theater, you called it, and you showed us where the water was bubbling up out of the ground. When we were there, we talked about a little bit about the difference between a gully ravine, which we have a lot of in the area as well, and a steephead. So what is the difference between a gully ravine and a steephead?
Well, here's how I discovered it for myself. Back in 1960s, early 60s, when I first came here and was a student at FSU, I got out of doors all the time. Fell in love with the area, and of course, Torreya State Park is a attraction. So I went there, and I found these magnificent ravines all over the place, very deep, steep-sided slopes, maybe at an angle of about 45 degrees. And down at the bottoms of those, if it had been raining or if I was far enough downstream, there was water trickling in it, and I found salamanders. I wanted to know what they were. Well, ultimately, that wound up being my master's project. Took me many years to work out. But it turns out while I was in Torreya State Park looking at the salamanders there, one day I was driving south, approaching what is now the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, and I saw this deep drop-off on my right-hand side. So I stopped, got out of the car, and wow, I walked down this, what turned out to be, I discovered a steephead. And it was chock full of my salamanders, but it was a very different environment from the ravines that were in Torreya State Park. So the bottom line is, all over the world, when rain hits the ground, if the ground is relatively impermeable, like clay sands, and it gullies. Everybody should know what a gully is. You've seen water that's etched ditches into the ground. But way up at the headwaters of these gully-eroded streams, you're on a ridge that falls off into another gully-eroded stream on the other side of the ridge, but there's no steep head at the upper ends of the creeks because the water, is falling on that ridge and then slowly gullying and making it deeper. So gully erosion is the main phenomenon that erodes and creates streams everywhere. But when you go down below Sweetwater Creek and you get into the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines area, and part of that now is a big chunk of Torreya State Park, you find in the Citronelle Formation that Harley was talking about, the deep sands there, you find these very deep ravines also. But when you go to the headwaters of them, you find they're an amphitheater, and they're almost as steep at the head of the stream to the top of the ridge as they are anywhere else along the stream. That's because erosion there is happening by, as Harley said, the water is leaking out of that perched aquifer, which is perched on top of the Jackson Bluff Formation. It's actually leaking, not bubbling up, it's leaking out laterally. And because there's an underground lake, and the head of the stream is allowing the water to bleed laterally out of that lake. Well, what happens is as that water bleeds laterally, it pulls that loose sand with it, undercutting the head. And as it undercuts it to a certain point, then the head sand slumps in, but because it's sand, the water keeps running through it and pulling it away, causing the head of the stream to migrate headward. Whereas in gully erosion, the migration is down, from the water that is running down the stream valley. It's tearing up and pulling dirt all along the valley, and the head is not migrating headward like in a steephead environment. So, all right, the bottom line is halfway between Torreya State Park and Bristol, there is a big stream called Sweetwater Creek that is the beginning of where the steepheads occur south of that. I discovered dozens of these big steepheads full of all of this salamander. Bottom line is, over the years and after, even into my doctoral work, I explored as many steepheads as I could, and I discovered they were also prominent and common elsewhere west of the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines, especially on Eglin Air Force Base and on other streams that were about the same latitude as those in the area of Apalachicola River. So I got into the literature and discovered that one of Harley's predecessors was the first geologist to recognize that a steephead was a geomorphologically distinct geological phenomenon. And about 1918, I forget the name of the Sellards.
Yeah, Sellards.
And then later on, in the 1930s, one other paper was published talking about them further west. So the geologists discovered steepheads and identified their unique geomorphology and how the bleeding or the sapping, they called it, of the groundwater created a steephead. Well, then as a biologist, I think I'm the first biologist to recognize how cool they were. And I published several papers in semi-technical and semi-popular literature early on to try to bring the focus onto steepheads and how neat they were. And it turns out I have looked all over the world and read literature all over the world. There's almost no steepheads anywhere else but in Panhandle, Florida, except over at Palatka Ravine Garden State Park and Goldhead Branch. There's a couple of steepheads on that side of the peninsula, upper peninsula of Florida. But elsewhere in the world, they don't seem to be found anywhere else but just in our panhandle.
Wow.
And they're like 150 or 200 or more. And if I live long enough, and Harley puts up with me long enough, he and I would like to finish a paper we've thought about starting on the biology of Florida steepheads. But somebody else has discovered how interesting they are. Do you know that Florida's steepheads have been used as a model to adduce the presence of water on Mars? And when you look from a satellite at the Florida steepheads, the way the steepheads migrate, they have a special signature.
The Christmas tree, sort of
like,
kind of like branches and branches.
But you can see that you can see the heads. You can understand. Whoa, that's not a classic gully eroded sort of a situation. And one of the papers about Mars actually has a picture of Florida steepheads from an aerial or a satellite image next to a satellite image or a spaceship image they took of Mars showing the same phenomenon.
I'll have to find that.
So, well, I'll send it to you.
Okay, yeah. So geologically, they're unique. But as a biologist, you started noticing some things about them. So talk about what do we find in these that makes them sort of biologically unique as well?
Well, they're biologically fascinating because the water that leaks into and runs their aquatic environment is almost completely perennial, meaning it never dries up. And the reason for that is there's this huge perched aquifer that is bleeding into these steepheads. You can imagine the aquifer during our 50 or 60 inches of annual rainfall, that water, a lot of it percolates down and builds up this underground lake that is bleeding into the steepheads. Well, it takes a long time for that lake to get, exhausted. Meanwhile, it's being restored by more rainfall, except that right now we're in this big drought.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going on now. But anyway, so that means that the animals and plants that live in a steephead environment are always experiencing the moisture in the soils and the creek. And so fishes, there are some fishes that go up those steepheads, some quite interesting ones. But there is a fire-backed crayfish that's only known from the Apalachicola ravines. Now, that includes the steepheads as well as the gully-eroded ravines.
Right.
And then that salamander I was so keen on studying, I discerned years ago it was a unique species, only known from the Apalachicola River system, but it's found both in the steepheads as well as in the gully-eroded ravines. But it's a unique species in that stream system.
Yeah.
But then we got the plants. Plants require moisture too. So in a steephead, especially those that are aligned east and west, on the north side of their slopes, the sun coming in from the south dries the slope out more than on the south side. The south side's in a sun shadow. So it turns out Torreya, the rare yew, and Taxus, another rare yew, both of them
Yew
seem
trees.
to be, yew trees. They're endemic species just found in the Apalachicola ravines, both the steepheads as well as the gully-eroded ravines, and not found anywhere else on Earth. And there's even an herbaceous plant called Crumia that's really ancient, and its closest relative is over in Asia, like the yew trees.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what I'm saying is the gully-eroded ravines will dry out, especially in a time like this, and animals and plants that require that nice moisture will be under big stress during drought times. But in steepheads, they're not.
Right. And that water is always running. It's kind of surprisingly fast, I think. I mean, it's a good flowing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it comes out. I have in my, 60 years, 60 years or more of going into several of those steepheads. I actually have photographs of an area almost the size of this room, which is like, say, 15 feet by 10 feet or more, that is slumped down and is being carried away, showing that the head is migrating. I mean, I actually can give you some statistics on how rapidly that one steephead is migrating headward. That's a diversion, but
it's interesting. How old are steephead ravines, do we think? I mean, when did a lot of these start?
Harley will have to tell you, they couldn't have started before the formation, right?
Correct. So the deposition of the citronelle formation, which is required for the formation, at least in this area of steepheads, it was deposited probably about 2.5 to 3 million years ago. Now, that's not to say that that's exactly when the steepheads started forming, but they certainly couldn't have started forming any earlier than that. However, I will caveat that by saying that there were probably other sand deposits that were deposited earlier that have long since eroded away that may have harbored steephead ravines, but those are long since gone. So now we have the modern ones today that are developing in the citronelle, at least in the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines area.
Right.
Well, one of the great things about those steepheads, that water is so clean. It's highly potable because it's coming out of that huge sand body. And the only thing that would contaminate it is anything people would dump on the ground surface that would percolate down and get into the underground aquifer that feeds all that. So let's hope. Well, years ago, Florida Natural Areas Inventory people and myself and others got really upset because there was a move afoot by a electric generating company to buy some of those steepheads and dam them up. And we had to fight that. And
Interesting.
Fortunately, a good many of the steepheads along the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines area are now in Torreya State Park or the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines property. Those on Eglin Air Force Base, which are even more spectacular, many of them, are subject to the vicissitudes of the politics that govern Air Force and other military installations, and you never know what's going to happen when we get into situations where people who are running those facilities are new people. They came from somewhere else. They don't know what a steep pit is, or they don't care. So we're always on the lookout for stopping, or trying to preserve and save our natural heritage.
So, Rob, let me throw something else out that I think is important that we haven't spoken about yet, and it's the not only the consistency, the amount of water that comes out of them, but it's also the constant temperature. Just like Florida's artesian spring water, right, that is a constant temperature, either from 68 to about 72 degrees, depending on where you are in the state. So too goes for the water that is flowing in these steep heads. Since it's aquifer water, it's generally about the average annual air temperature in the areas where these steep heads occur.
Harley's absolutely right. And what I would like to see happen is in the future, these ravines all of our area needs to be studied more by biologists. I would guess that because of what he's talking about, the buffering effect of thermal and moisture regimes in steepheads, that there are invertebrate animals like mayflies or tiny little crustaceans called amphipods and isopods that might actually be endemic and found in these ravines. We just haven't found anyone studying them yet.
Interesting. There's a groundwater lab at FAMU. I've done a couple stories, and he usually goes into spring caves to do that. That'd be an interesting thing to bring up. To check that out. Yeah,
for sure.
So through DNA, he's finding all kinds of interesting things about their distribution.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll hear this podcast.
Yeah, or maybe I ought to send it to him. So I want to go back to salamanders. So we talked about the Apalachicola dusky salamander, which is what brought you in there. You were looking to differentiate it from another salamander that's found not too far away. Talk a little bit about that story and how you came to find out that this is a whole separate animal.
Right. The salamanders I was interested in belong in a big genus called Desmognathus, and it turns out they're notable for being extremely variable. A given population of the same species will have dark adults and colorful females and colorful juveniles. Then if you go downstream, you can get into another group of animals that are variable also, but they're on average a little different. Anyway, the long of it was, in those days I had to use morphology and behavior and geography because DNA was not, invented as far as studying it and using it to study taxonomy. And I determined that there was a population of salamanders in the Apalachicola bluffs and ravines that was at the headwaters, up at these steep heads itself. And every steep head had that population, and I could characterize its morphology. And as you go downstream, the streams, of course, get bigger and bigger, and eventually they get so big during rainy periods that they overtop their banks, and they create a little floodplain. And when the water goes back down, that floodplain is wet and has swampy, mucky places in it. And that's where I found another salamander that was being confused with the Apalachicola dusky. And then eventually I named the Apalachicola dusky, and it is held up to DNA scrutiny. It's only found in our Apalachicola ravines, actually also in the Ochlockonee ravines.
Around Lake Talcott, yeah.
And that's because the Ochlockonee River was probably connected to the Apalachicola River through Taloja Creek at one time. Anyway, that's a small, interesting sidebar.
Yeah.
But then the salamander that I discovered downstream in the mucky areas is called the southern dusky salamander. They're all called dusky salamanders. I shouldn't have said Desmognathus. And
it's good to say both.
Yeah. Actually, that means dusky jaw.
Oh.
Yeah. So that salamander was common all throughout Panhandle, Florida, all the way down the peninsula to about Tampa, all the way up the peninsula and into South Georgia. And while I was studying it and made taxonomic sense out of that, this was in the 1970s. I got my PhD doing some of that. I started discovering that it was not common where it had been abundant. and by 1980 they were gone. So throughout the range of this species, it's completely disappeared from all of the steep heads and all the gully-eroded ravines that it used to occur in West Florida, and then the further downstream habitats in the Apalachicola. It's gone.
The southern dusky.
The southern dusky is gone. And why, I do not know. I had a graduate student who has worked on that problem. We think it probably was one of these diseases, the chytrid fungus disease, but it's very difficult to prove that. Anyway, that's a sidebar. But all of the rest of the dusky salamanders in Florida, southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and peninsular Florida are gone, and we don't know why. They just disappeared. I mean, there were places where I could see 40 or 50 of these individuals in a couple of hours of just looking around in the habitat.
Yeah.
And now there's none to be found whatsoever.
So they used to be found in the same steephead ravine systems, just in different places of them?
Downstream farther, where the stream got to be swampy and mucky.
Yeah.
The habitat changed. The upstream parts are very aerated, like Harley said, very cool. But as you go downstream, it gets warmer because the stream, doesn't have fresh input to it, and sunlight hits it, and it gets mucky.
And so they're both in the same genus of animals, so they're closely related. But I guess the Apalachicola dusky salamander is more closely related to other dusky salamanders not in the state than it is to the southern dusky. Is that correct?
Yeah, the closest relatives are up in the southern Appalachians.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's so easy to understand is the Apalachicola River and the ravines in our own Torrilla State Park and Bluffs and Ravines area. Those ravines occur all the way up the river, Chattahoochee River, all the way into the headwaters, which are in the southern Appalachians of North Georgia. So that has been a corridor of ravines going from North Georgia mountains all the way to our bluffs and ravines, allowing plants and animals to migrate upstream or downstream during climate changes of the Pleistocene, the glacial ages. Yeah. And, our last glacial age ended, Harley, about 10, 12,000 years ago as sea level started coming up.
11,700.
So let's say just 10,000 years ago, sea level was 300 or more feet lower, and a lot of things that were up north had come down and populated our ravines down here, and things have changed, gotten warmer, and who knows what's going to happen to them now because it's getting warmer and warmer. Are they going to die out? Are they going to migrate upstream? Anyway, there's no other stream system in Florida whose headwaters are outside of the coastal plain, and the Apalachicola River is the only one whose headwaters drain the Blue Ridge of the southern Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, and so steepheads are considered an ice age refugia. Is that the correct term?
Yes,
and so
absolutely right.
Let's talk about that, and talk about some of these other plants too that have come down and that are here in Florida, and then are closely related to things in the Appalachians, and then maybe in between there's not as much of them.
I mean, there's enough ravines going up and down that there are a lot of things that are in Florida that occur all the way up and down today, like mountain laurel.
Right.
A beautiful plant. It's a woody plant that's found up north and in Florida. One thing that is even more important to know than the Pleistocene stuff, the Apalachicola bluffs and ravines are an ancient refugium for Miocene and plants. Yeah. The Torrilla and the yew and the Crumia are part of an ancient Miocene arcto-tertiary geoflora that used to occur more widely all over the southeast United States, and the last remnants of them are found in the Torrilla ravines area. So we have that as a refugium sort of a situation going back, 18 or more million years? And the Pleistocene stuff that you see today, and I don't have my list with me. I'm not a botanist, but there's a whole bunch of them.
Things like pyramid magnolia.
That's one, yeah.
And
So with you saying that about the Miocene connection, it might be interesting to take a look at the fossil flora that we know is found in the Alum Bluff group, undifferentiated sediments, and see if there are representatives in there that might be distant relatives of the modern ones.
Yes, for sure. You would think that would be the case. I guess I have never seen any evidence that the two U's were in that flora, but you would think they might have been, Maybe they just haven't turned up yet.
Well, it was certainly a more temperate climate,
Yeah.
at least based on the analyses done on the fossil flora.
How rare is it to find fossils of trees compared to, like a vertebrate animal?
Well, Rob, it's actually very rare to find fossils, period.
Yeah.
And the fact that Florida has so many of them is probably, we're a little spoiled here. In the grand scheme of things, plants don't typically fossilize as readily as the hard remains of vertebrates and mollusks and things like that. So I'd say it's pretty rare wherever you find it. We're lucky in Florida at Alum Bluff. You can actually find preserved leaves and nuts and things like that, as well as the carbonized trunks of some of these trees that lived back then. So we get them both here.
Gotcha.
But they're rare.
So going back to steepheads, so they're made of sand from the Citronelle Formation. And so something I learned the first time I went out with you to a steephead. So what was that sand was once a barrier island, is that correct? Or
well, in some areas, yes. But that sand has been transported down here, and actually all of the quartz sand that we have in Florida ultimately was transported down here from the erosion of the Appalachian Mountains. And so rivers and streams have been carving and cutting down into that, into those mountains. And the reason we have quartz sand down here and not some of the other minerals is because quartz is so hard. And so it's really about the only thing that survives a trip through, that distance in a river tumbled along, for many hundreds of miles to be deposited down here in Florida. So some of the quartz sand deposits in Florida were deposited as barrier islands and dunes, and we see that across Florida's landscape. We have quite a few, and we call them paleo dunes and paleo barrier islands. At Alum Bluff, per se, that's probably not the case, except for maybe a little bit of the very uppermost part of the quartz sand deposits that exist there. So you couldn't say all of that's exposed there, that is the Citronelle Formation, is a barrier island deposit.
He's the Florida state geologist, so I will not, in my opinion, I thought that most of that was a barrier island based on what was his work?
Tanner.
A guy named Tanner, but that's what happens in science. You don't always agree, even though he's my son.
Well, I mean, we're talking about things that happened so long ago. I mean, I guess the more we learn about things, you can kind of maybe interpret things, but, obviously we can't ever go back and see what it was. So we have all these different clues we put together to figure out, well, yes, it could have been this, or it was likely this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is something I like about these deep time stories and the archaeological stories as well. Yeah.
Well, what's great about Florida from a geological perspective is, all these marine processes and all these marine deposits that we have as part of Florida's geology. You can go down to the modern coastline and see modern analogs, and that's what geologists oftentimes will refer to when we're trying to figure out, all right, how did this deposit form? What's the nature of the material that it's made out of? What fossils does it have? And I'll be darned, it's got these mollusks, and today we see mollusks that are very similar that live in estuarine deposits or estuaries. So that's a big help for us to tease out these past environments and the geology that was left behind because of them.
One of the fascinating things about the Florida Panhandle is that although it's relatively flat, except for places like Apalachicola Bluffs, it is extremely variable enough in its geology and its underlying habitats that the Florida Panhandle, from about Tallahassee to Pensacola, is about the top biodiversity hotspot in the United States and Canada, and that is respect with plants as well as animals of different kinds, not so much mammals, but amphibians and reptiles are very abundant in that area, more so than any other part of the southeastern United States. And if you go south of the Apalachicola bluffs and ravines a short distance and you get into the flatwoods of the Apalachicola National Forest, you get a huge additional jump up in biodiversity because there are all kinds of beautiful wet flat environments full of pitcher plants and carnivorous plants that don't occur in the bluffs and ravines at all. Years ago, the early biogeographers used to think, well, all of that's the same phenomenon. No, it's not. Below about Hotspot, which is about where the ends of that sand that is got steep heads to the north, when you drive down Florida Road 65 going towards the coast, you go through the western half of the Apalachicola National Forest with chock full of about 15 plants found in that area and nowhere else on Earth, including a couple of snakes and goodness knows what else, if people would start studying the invertebrates.
Right.
So
that's the Apalachicola lowlands, I guess you would call that.
That's exactly right, yeah.
So it's kind of a neat region between that and the Apalachicola bluffs and ravines, all on one side of the river too.
Yeah.
Back to the bluffs and ravines. So there's, we talked about Gully Ravine, Steephead Ravines, Alum Bluff, a lot of cool things. Let's talk about a couple other fun features. I want to talk about Means Creek. So obviously the name sounds familiar.
I'll tell you how it got named, Means Creek. I've been here a long time. When Florida Natural Areas Inventory got started, I had a couple of contracts with them. One of them was to identify rare and unusual environments. And one of the environments that I discovered, other people I'm sure have seen it, was this thing they have called Means Creek after me, thank you, because as you go upstream, first off, we're talking about all the steep heads you encounter. They're in that sandy citronelle, but then when you get above Sweetwater Creek, you start getting the clays of what are those? They're part of.
So you get the Torreya Formation and then ultimately the Chattahoochee Formation, which is the lower part of Means Creek has eroded down into that.
Okay, so what happens is, what I thought was so special about Means Creek is the water that gullies down, it has hit limestone, and what does acidic water do when it hits basic limestone? It dissolves it. So it's dissolved its lower part of its valley into limestone. And so you actually, when you walk up the stream, you can walk on a hard rock bed and you put your hands out and you touch vertical lime rock sidewalls that are having seepage come down out of the overlying material above. And the seepage is creating these wonderful rock faces that are wet and full of mosses and liverworts and salamanders and all kinds of good stuff. So I proposed that to FNI, and they recognize it. When you go further north, you don't get that. Just that one stream is unique in that regard. And fortunately, they say, oh, that's Means Creek, and that name is stuck.
Yeah.
And I'm tickled.
It's such a cool place. And then you walk in there, and not only, you're walking and there's rock walls to the side of you, eventually you end up in a cave.
Yes.
And then you climb out of the cave.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And all that'll keep, in the future, keep dissolving out, and who knows how far that cave will go back. It may go quite a bit underground that you can't get into because the mouth of it is sort of broken down and closed. But who knows how far that cave goes underground.
Yeah. So in 2016, Harley, you were on the first day of River Trek, the Apalachicola River Trek kayak expedition, and we went into Means Creek, and you identified what someone had noticed, a couple little things popping out of the rock wall, and you said, what were they?
So those were the ribs of an ancient dugong that swam in Florida's nearshore marine environment more than 20 million years ago.
Yeah.
So the formations that are exposed that far north are different than the ones that are exposed at Alum Bluff. And the reason is because as you go further north, you get into older and older sediments because the sediments are actually slightly tilted and they, what geologists call, they dip down to the south. So the further south you go, the younger the sediments are at land surface. And part of that has to do with some erosion that has taken place. And right there where Means Creek is, and a little further to the north, right at Chattahoochee, you cross the river and you get into a different geomorphic area that we call the Doherty Karst Plain. And karst is a familiar term, and just like Dad explained, when you've got acidic groundwater that interacts with carbonate materials like limestone, over geologic time, it can dissolve away and create void spaces. And in this instance, one of Florida's only steep-sided,
rock wall,
incised stream valleys. It's all about geology, is what I like to tell Dad.
Right.
As amazing as the biology is, the biology wouldn't be there if it weren't for the geology. And one of the reasons it's so diverse in that area is because the geology is diverse.
True.
So you've worked together a little bit. I mean, talk about growing up with Bruce as your dad, and you've been studying these areas, and I'm guessing you've seen some of these areas since you were probably pretty young. Talk about, I guess, this area, how it might have influenced you in your career choices.
Well, Rob, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, at the time I was growing up, I did not appreciate and realize how lucky and unique an upbringing that I was being given. And so, you know, I grew up on Tall Timbers Research Station when Dad was the director there, and, you know, going out and sitting on the back of a motorcycle with a radio telemetry antenna, riding around trying to identify where eastern diamondback rattlesnakes were. I just thought this was something that all kids got to do. And it wasn't until I was somewhat older and started forming friendships with people, and they're like, "You do what?" So it afforded me a huge head start, particularly because I was interested in science. I was stimulated by all the things that, you know, I got to see and experience. And yes, I got, in some instances, drug all over the Panhandle and all over the southeastern U.S. In many instances, it was just a great pleasure, and I have nothing but amazing memories. And it absolutely is one of the major reasons why I became a geologist. I didn't follow immediately in his footsteps as an ecologist, biologist, but I appreciate it, and I think it gives me a unique perspective as a geologist to understand what's the connection between geology and biology.
I like to think that both Harley and my son Ryan went into nature, natural history, because of something I didn't do. Every time I was getting ready to go outside and go look for a rattlesnake or whatever I was going to do, I didn't say, "Hey guys, come on, let's go do such and so." I just got up and started walking out, and they'd say, "Hey Dad, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to go, can we come?" "Oh yeah, sure." And had I forced them to do it, I don't think they'd followed it. Anyway, I don't know if that's true. I mean, it's true that I deliberately did not try to force them, but I exposed them to everything and anything they could possibly want to be interested in.
Yeah.
Coins and stamps and rocks and
Collecting.
yeah.
Right. And I've seen some of the fossil collection anyway at your office, and I know probably you and Ryan found some of that and found archaeological sites and things like that. So it's kind of cool to keep that collecting thing gonna.
It is, Rob, and you know it's a part of being outside. You know, when you're observing things and you're outside and you're kicking around looking at new stuff, I mean, you're going to run into that kind of thing in Florida. And it was my exposure to somebody who took it the next step and not only was interested in it and collected it, but also wanted to know, what is it? Why is it important? Where did it come from? How old is it?
You know, how many people I meet, we don't even have to be talking about you specifically, but if it's maybe it's a comment on Facebook, if I do a story on Apalachicola bluffs and ravines, or if I'm just talking about steephead ravines, or just in general, people they're talking about nature experiences that they remember. A lot of people talk about taking your classes, and a lot of them seem to remember going to steephead ravines. And they're like, "Yeah, Bruce Means took us to a steephead ravine."
Because it's a hell of a... I took them to the one that was so hard to get out of when you got down in it.
Yeah. And then there's this thing you did when we did the Diamondback story where you put your arm in the stump and then you pretend to get bit. And I was talking to somebody and they're like, yeah, and he puts his hand in, or maybe that was a comment. Like, he did the same thing to our class when we went. So I hear a lot of people talk about, I took this class with Bruce Means.
Well, I'm very pleased that I did. For about 15 years, I taught. I put over, I think I counted one time, 1,800 people, not students at FSU, but local people mostly, took it through the Center for Professional Development.
Yeah.
And it took them on 6 all Saturday field trips.
Well, let me tell you this too, Rob. That class was instrumental in more things than you know. A lot of people that worked at DEP at the time took Dad's class, and it was because of Dad's class that they appreciated and understood why the work they were doing was important.
Yeah.
We don't have now a Bruce Means teaching these classes, and I think it does a huge disservice to people who want to work in conservation. How do you learn about this area?
Thank you both for being here today. Thanks, Harley Means, Bruce Means, for coming on to Coast to Canopy.
Well, thank you, Rob, for having us. It's been a great pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Thank you.
If you watch the video version of this episode, you can see what keeps bringing me back to the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines region. Rugged terrain, rare plants and animals, unexpected vistas. You can find all of this at wfsu.org/ecologyblog and the WFSU Ecology YouTube channel. The post for this episode will connect you to many more stories. All of those videos, podcast episodes, and blog posts are made possible with support from viewers and listeners like you. WFSU is both an NPR and PBS station, and we can't serve our community without your support. For a $10 a month pledge, I'll give you a shout out on this podcast, like right now. Thank you to Karen Berkeley, Margaret Bivens, David Blair, Beth Garraway, Carol Goodyear, Veronica Humphrey, Lisa Johnson, Chris McFarland, Carrie Maddox, Clara Mullins, Mary Pohl, Alina Pryor, Thomas and Helen Roth, Dylan Riles Hamilton, Kim Sash, and Donna Tharp. We've also had several smaller donations, which I really appreciate. Any amount helps. You can join the Seed Circle at wfsu.org/ecologyblog. This has been Coast to Canopy, an ecology podcast from WFSU Public Media. Today we had Taylor Cox running audio and Jason Acuna directing video. I am your host and producer of all things ecology at WFSU, Rob Diaz de Villegas.